Okay, well, we'll go ahead and dig into everything. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on a Monday for the last EDF Solutions Seminar of the year. We know we're in that final stretch before a nice and well-deserved holiday break, so really grateful to have everyone here for this conversation, which I think is a really exciting topic for an often abstract and sometimes dry discussion around COP and negotiations, but really thinking about what does this mean in practice and what really specific actionable projects is EDF working on to really drive the high-level multilateral space and decision-making process into real impacts on the ground. So I'm Jane Eisenhardt. I'm Net Zero Engagement Manager for the Net Zero Action Accelerator team on EDF plus Biz. I was very lucky to represent Biz on the COP delegation this year, so I'm excited to be moderating this conversation today, guiding the discussion and bringing in the perspective of how it felt in Belém, having recently gotten back. So before introducing our amazing panelists, I want to first give an overview of what COP is all about. And again, I think COP can feel like many different things, and it's grown into different branches, different purposes throughout the years. It started as the annual gathering for the Conference of the Parties for the Paris Agreement. So historically, this has meant negotiations, and this is what we've really seen over the news and in a lot of the global pickup of what COP is intended to be for. But over time, we've really started to see this include more and more spaces with civil society, with non-state actors, with a lot of evolving agendas. So some of the projects that we'll be talking about today are really thinking about actors beyond countries and even beyond governments, to think about businesses, to think about NGOs and the spaces that we fill. So there's many different spaces at COP. We have countries discussing official text in the Blue Zone, to side events, to roundtables coordinated by NGOs and civil society, and all kinds of activities happening in and outside of the venue. These conferences are quite large. This year it was estimated there were over 50,000 people, and they're growing over time. So every year we hear more and more people are going to different places to have these kinds of discussions in person. There's all kinds of different outcomes and activities taking place beyond the policy and negotiations that we hear about a lot in the news. So for EDF, we're really engaged with other NGOs and non-state actors. And what this means is we host a lot of panels, we have bilaterals with key stakeholders, building relationships and profiling EDF's work. We also help to deliver the COP programs in the voluntary space, such as the Action Agenda this year, which was a new part of COP designed by the Brazilian presidency, the Climate Champions team, and the UNFCCC. We'll hear more about this later. But yeah, many different spaces, and I think COP can look really different depending on the stakeholders that you work with. So we'll hear about this from the speakers as we get started. But I just wanted to also give a bit more context on the action agenda, because this is something that we'll be hearing about from a few of our presentations. And it can sound, again, pretty abstract, and action and agenda aren't very specific. So giving a bit more insight into what this looked like. The action agenda was an official program, again, launched by the presidency of the UN and the Climate Champions team. And the intention this year of developing this was focusing on the voluntary space in a more in-depth way, moving from mobilization, which we've seen over the past 5 years. We've seen lots of new campaigns, lots of new sign-ons, net zero really picking up globally. But as we get closer to 2030, we're seeing that it's time to really turn that mobilization and these big ambitious pledges into real actions and initiatives for decarbonization. So the action agenda is designed to facilitate and coordinate this process at the global scale. The Brazilian presidency had 30 different thematic areas within this action agenda, covering topics from blue food systems to non-CO2 gases to information integrity, you name it. It was an all-encompassing agenda. And this was not intended to create new programs, but really building on what we've already agreed on in the Paris Agreement and focusing on delivering. So that's what this webinar is focusing on today, that delivering element and how EDF is driving this work forward. So with that, I want to pass it to our first speaker. We will be focusing, well, I'll give a quick overview of the agenda. We're first going to have a bit of a macro level perspective, hearing about EDF's work on global food systems and COP. And then we'll go into some presentations on specific coalitions and projects that EDF is leading, have a little panel discussion, and then open the floor for Q&A. So please have your questions ready and share them with us, and we will be excited to open the floor for a conversation at the end. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker. We have Abhinav Gaurav, lead advisor of Sustainable Dairy, who was also on the ground in Belém. And I want to turn to him to hear a bit about being really deeply connected to the COP process this year. Abhinav, can you tell us about your work on Sustainable Dairy, a bit more about your role, and then tell us what did it feel like on the ground in Belém for you?
Thanks, Sheikh. Jane, good morning and good day to people who have joined from different parts of the world. As Jane said, I'm Dr. Abhinav Gaurav. I lead EDF's livestock work and sustainable dairy work in India and smallholder dairy systems. In terms of what I do, who I am, so I am a veterinarian by training, and I work with EDF and with our partners in India in developing sustainable broad-based solutions that can achieve triple win for the entire sector. That is better yield and productivity from the dairy herd, which will also mean that better economic returns for the farmers and the value chain players, and at the same time should have a climate win at the heart of it. So these kind of broad-based solution we try to develop in India, where where per animal productivity is less, where the farmers are not able to make enough economic returns from the dairy sector. So how we can integrate climate sciences into it and develop a win-win solution for all. So that's broadly my work in India. I was at COP this year with Jane, and it was quite different. To be honest, this was my first COP, and being in Belém felt very different from whatever I've heard from others about the previous one. There was a real sense of place. The discussions weren't abstract. They were happening inside a region that has been at the front line of climate impact and nature losses. So people who don't know about Belém is at the edge of Amazon region, and based on the estimates will be the second hottest region in the world by 2050. So you could feel both the pride and pressure of Amazon all around us. There was also a notable shift, Jane, which I felt was who was shaping the dialogue. It was the indigenous people, local governments, farmers, youth voices. They weren't just symbolic participants, they were very active agenda setters. And kudos to the COP presidency for giving them the space and the voice to, to share their angst, their perspective. And that gave the conversations in the pavilions a strong grounding in equity, community, and nature-based resilience. So, if I may take a moment in terms of summarizing, the ambition was high. Everyone understands the science and the stake. The anxiety was also high. The indigenous community were quite vociferous. They were not waiting for another COP, another negotiation. They wanted some solutions. And so is the urgency was real. The nature protection, the food system transformation are seen less as side issues. And this year, I felt that it was core of climate solutions. So yes, the term nature cop, which was given during those presidency times, was quite well earned for, at least in terms of energy and the expectations on ground.
And going specifically to food systems, I think many felt that it was a disappointing outcome when the text from COP only mentioned food once and not even specifically food systems. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on this?
it's true. The negotiated outcomes did not reflect the level of urgency we saw in pavilions, the side events, or in the technical working groups, or what we were expecting as NGOs or as as global citizen. Only one reference to food and no mention of food system is not aligned with the sciences that the agri-food systems are going to be central for the climate action in future. While the political text honestly lagged, the implementation ecosystem at COP, I felt, moved meaningfully forward. The pavilions were abuzz with the next steps. So the big reflection for me, based on what you said in terms of, in terms of what was written text, that the political recognition is still catching up. Many still feel agriculture as complex and sensitive, which is very justified. But at the same time, there are countries, companies, financiers, um, multilaterals, NGOs like us are already taking action irrespective of formal text. Coalition for Food System and multiple activation groups created very concrete pathways in terms of better measurements, finances, policy alignments that didn't exist last year. So this was a very welcome step. For example, FAST partnership was highly active this year's COP. They were mobilizing finances, climate finances for better for better resilient food systems, for agriculture, for driving implementation through initiatives like RIAS and Terra. So yes, the outcome could have been much stronger. I agree with you, but I would feel that the engine is already running, and now the focus shifts from word to more action on ground in the supply chains.
And you already started mentioning some of the partnerships, but could you tell us a bit more of the partners and the kinds of people and organizations that you were meeting with on the ground at COP?
So there were very diverse set of partners. I met with people from CCAC, from GMH, from IDF. There were like FAO was there and CG institutions were there. So I met a very broad variety of people in the food space, and they all were quite optimistic about future in terms of the collective action. There were many, coalitions that were not built only on, discussion forums. There were more action oriented, implementation oriented meetings we had, which were aimed towards better measurements, how we can have better quantify methane emissions, for example, from the dairy sector. What are the different feed interventions, how we can marriage both productivity gains and its impact on climate action, specifically from Indian perspective. We also like met with people who were very much focused on how to bring in incentives that can incentivize farmers and the value chain actors in terms of transitioning to a more greener future. So these were there, and there were many discussions on collaboration as well, like with EDF being at the forefront of it. So I met with many of the partners from the DEMA ecosystem that EDF has created. So these were very constructive dialogues that we had at COP with various partners and stakeholders.
And did they feel different in person?
Yes, they did. So the discussions were very, you know, you can only discuss so much through documents and through, these web chats and all. At COP you got that grounding that we are here for a common purpose, a common higher purpose, and while you discuss in person and you share your ideas, and when you listen to each other's idea, there are multiple opportunities and avenues get open. So I would say that meeting them in person was much more fruitful. We were able to exchange ideas and contacts beyond what we could have done otherwise.
Yeah, I think there's something so special about having what feels like the whole world together in one
Uh,
space. I think that's one
yeah,
of the really indescribable parts of COP is just having all of the different country pavilions, people
yeah,
really representing where they're from. It's like diversity in a way that we really struggle to feel online.
yeah,
So that's quite special.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for setting the scene for our panel discussion. I think now we'll turn to some of the programs that EDF has been focusing on to deliver the goals discussed at COP, particularly with a view on the action agenda. So we have with us here Vishal Kapate, Senior Manager for Global Dairy Industry, EDF Plus Business, Carly Kelso, Director of Climate Resilient Food Systems, and Laura Anderson, who was the Engagement Project Manager of the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. So I will turn it to you all to give us some brief presentations of your work, tell us a bit of what you're up to and EDF's role in it, and showcasing how EDF is generating measurable on-the-ground impacts. I think I'll first pass it to Rashab to kick off the presentations.
Thank you, Jane and Shara. If you could just help bring the slides up, that'd be great.
A reminder for those who joined late, we will have a Q&A at the end, so please have any questions, reflections ready, we're very open to having a conversation. So please send anything our way. Great.
Thank you so much, Jane, for having me this today. My name is Rashab Kapate. I'm a senior manager for the global dairy sector at Environmental Defense Fund, and I lead our work with dairy companies globally to drive climate ambition and action, where we strive to find win-wins for the business and the planet. And so, if we move to the next slide, I would like to begin with just setting the context. Over the last few years, the attention from investors, consumers, and civil society has really raised the profile of methane. This is visible in the focus that methane has gotten at international stages like COP that Abhinav was just mentioning, but also across some of the other key events like New York Climate Week, or other events. And so we've seen, what we sometimes joke and say that methane has moved from the kids table to now the adults table. And um, coming to the opportunity, methane makes up over 60% of on-farm emissions in dairy. And so with that kind of lion share represented by methane, as we approach 2030, methane is becoming a critical lever for companies with dairy in their supply chain to address in order to meet their climate goals, and therefore provides a critical opportunity for dairy intensive companies to lead in what we are seeing to be the methane movement. There is climate science associated to this due to the short-lived nature. So methane is active in the environment and atmosphere for about 12 years. And then the potency of methane. Methane is more than 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide at when you look at it from a 100 years time frame. But when you look at it from a 20-year time frame, methane becomes more than 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And therefore, both the short-lived nature and the potency of methane makes it an incredible emergency brake for the climate. And therefore, tackling methane becomes an essential to avoid critical tipping points. And so, with that context set, if we could move to the next slide, I'd like to just give an overview of what the Dairy Methane Action Alliance is. So, the Dairy Methane Action Alliance is a global initiative to spur action and accountability to drive down methane emissions. Signatories that are global food and ag companies commit to two key milestones. The first is measure and publicly disclose methane emissions, and the second to develop a public methane action plan. And so these two commitments are essentially the foundational building block for action. So you measure and you create an action plan, and that is what the alliance is about. The Alliance is supported and administered by non-industry players, including Environmental Defense Fund and series who provide technical support and also facilitate collaboration. So if we move to the next slide, we'll get a sense of who are the companies that are stepping forward on methane. So you can see on your screens the list of leading food and ag companies that are part of DEMA. The Dairy Methane Action Alliance was launched at COP28 in Dubai at a President's Track event with six major global food companies as inaugural signatories. Since the launch, we have added additional companies, growing the cohort to 10 companies. These companies represent over 200 billion in annual sales and represent household brands that many of you will recognize across the globe and would have in your pantries and refrigerators. And so these are not just one kind of company. These are the cohort is extremely diverse, with companies sourcing across geographies, across farm systems, including the global top 20 dairy companies represented within the Dairy Methane Action Alliance. So if we move to the next slide, I spoke about the key milestones that companies are committing to, but they're not just doing it on their own. There is a lot of support that is available from EDF and the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, including our partners at Ceres and Pure Strategies, and in two key buckets. So the first one is the technical guidance. So since the launch of the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, we have four guides one on accounting, one on disclosure, one on action planning, and one on supplier and stakeholder engagement. That is not just available to companies within the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, but to any company that wants to take action. And so these also follow along the trajectory that we have set for these companies. So the first and second guides help you determine what your dairy methane component is and how to disclose it. The action planning guide helps you create the action plan with templates and solutions that are available. And then the fourth and final guide, the supplier and stakeholder engagement guide, helps companies activate that plan. And so these are the four guides that are available, which companies need help not just with the why, but also the how to do it. And these guys help clarify the why and make the process very actionable. So that's one piece that's more publicly available, but there's also some work that's been happening behind the scenes, and so that's the second pillar, which is the knowledge to action sessions. Um, if we speak to companies across the food and ag sector, there continues to exist a lot of common barriers that everyone faces, and so these knowledge to action sessions are safe space conversations to share successes, identify common barriers, but also identifying collective action opportunities to be able to speed action and scalability. And so over the course of the last year and a half, we have topics that include financing, measurement, farmer engagement, taking a particular solution and deep diving into that. And so the group meets every other month and has an opportunity to deep dive into these kind of topics. So if we go to the next slide, we'll get an opportunity to just kind of zoom back and see our journey so far. So like I mentioned, we launched at COP28 in Dubai. And since then, in addition to the technical guidance and the facilitation bit that I just spoke, the key disclosures have also been happening. So we've seen tremendous progress since DEMA was launched, with 7 of the 10 companies. So we added 3 companies this year. So all but those 3 companies have disclosed their dairy methane emissions and signaled how material it is to their overall inventory and how critical it is in their journey towards climate action. But in addition to that, we also have 5 companies that have disclosed the world's first dairy methane action plans. These include from Danone, Starbucks, General Mills, Lactalis US, and Bell. And so these are essentially not just leading the sector, but globally leading the way in what transparency and action planning could mean. And so if we move to the next slide, that's kind of the journey in a nutshell, and I'm happy to kind of take answers and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Rishabh. We'll dive into some questions in a bit, but first I'll turn it to Carly and Laura for your presentation on aquatic blue foods.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'll wait for our PowerPoint to come on screen before I start. Wonderful. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Kelso, and I am with the Fisheries and Oceans Program at Environmental Defense Fund. Today, my colleague Laura and I are going to speak about our partnership on the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. But before we do, I want to provide a bit of additional context of why this topic of aquatic blue foods. Next slide, please. So as we already noted, food is a major contributor to climate change, and the global community has acknowledged that the sector can no longer be ignored. It needs to be part of the conversation when we look at strategies for mitigation and adaptation. The movement's been focused on transforming the food system. And when we say the food system, we mean everything from production to transportation, processing, packaging, storage, retail, consumption, and loss and waste of food. And it's really important because food systems are responsible for about 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. They threaten about 86% of species at risk of extinction. They're the single largest driver of marine biodiversity loss, and the sector is rife with inequities. And most importantly, it's failing to feed and nourish nearly 1 billion people today. And not only is it driving issues with climate change is going to worsen this while we have a growing global population. So for a long time, when we were talking about this issue, it's been really terrestrially focused. So EDF and partners have been leading on integrating aquatic foods into the conversation. Next slide. As I mentioned, aquatic foods have not always been part of the conversation. They were quite literally being left off the menu. To define aquatic foods, they are fish, shellfish, aquatic plants, and algae that are captured or harvested in both marine and freshwater. And they're super important as critical sources of food, nutrition, and livelihoods. Globally, 1 in 5 people depend on aquatic foods as for a source of their vital micronutrients. And this is sources and micronutrients are not easily replaced from other sources. They also provide over 3 billion people around the world their daily protein. And they're especially important for coastal and rural communities in the global south, and especially in the developing tropics where the vulnerability to malnutrition and food insecurity are especially high. Next slide, please. So the Aquatic Food System, the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition was formed out of the 2021 UN Food System Summit. This was the first UN conference aimed at how the global community can transform our food systems and help progress the Sustainable Development Goals. In the beginning, aquatic foods had a limited focus and a limited time on the agenda, but a group of like-minded partners and governments came together to elevate the topic. And as an outcome of the summit, the coalition was formed. The coalition is helping to translate Blue Food momentum into action by bringing research into policy and creating action on the ground. We now have 65 members, including 16 governments, as you could see on the screen. And the leadership comes from Iceland, who chairs the coalition, as well as technical guidance from Environmental Defense Fund, Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and Oceana. We have 3 main objectives that we're leading for the coalition. The first is to engage high-level decision makers at national, regional, and international levels to advocate for the recognition and integration of Blue Food's potential in the transformation towards food systems that deliver for both people and the planet. We connect and work with multiple stakeholders to mobilize investment, technical capacity, and partnership for countries or groups of countries who are looking to integrate aquatic foods into their food systems policy. And the last objective is to foster knowledge exchange between members and provide them with support to catalyze action in key regions by helping them to understand Blue Food's needs and possibilities and matching them with funding and/or technical assistance. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Carly. So I'll hop in on sort of one of the examples of technical assistance and resources that the coalition has been providing for country members and others, and share sort of this document, this report that we worked on together that launched last year by the institutions that you see on the screen. And these were sort of meeting a need that in discussions about nationally determined contributions and national climate strategies, there were a kind of a lack of resources about how aquatic foods could fit into the picture and what types of targets or policies might be relevant within climate strategies. So the group of partners that you see on your screen brought together a synthesized report on opportunities for integrating Blue Foods into national climate strategies. And these were meant to be a starting point for countries thinking about setting targets or developing policies related to Blue Foods and climate. They were organized in 5 intervention areas that touch on different parts of aquatic food systems. So like Carly mentioned, it's not only sort of opportunities to reduce emissions within fisheries or aquaculture production, but also thinking about consumption and supply chains and how Blue Foods interact with different habitats that might be able to both be relevant for mitigation as well as adaptation. And in addition to the 5 intervention areas, the report includes information about cross-cutting enabling measures, so things like research and development, equitable access to finance or resources, case study examples where countries are taking action related to blue foods and climate, and example concrete measures. Next slide, please. And this year we took that global report and thought about ways to tailor them more specifically to country contexts. So we worked on 4 country case studies in Ghana, Indonesia, Mexico, and Vietnam that curated data on blue food production, trade, consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate risks to identify more country-specific and country-relevant opportunities for mitigation and adaptation in food systems. So next slide, please. Carly will share how some of that more technical guidance and resources and research connect to some of the stakeholder engagement work that EDF has been leading.
Thank you, Laura. So as a global organization, EDF has teams working on the ground, and we engaged with our Mexico team to take this case study, this academic, and pair it with a stakeholder engagement component for the project. So our team on the ground last December brought together government institutions, scientific organizations, and civil society organizations from within Mexico to devise strategies to consider blue food as a solution to Mexico's food and climate challenges. It was a full-day event, and there were 6 thematic areas, from blue foods, a strategic component of food security, food policy in Mexico, innovation and technology and production, blue justice, conservation of biocultural heritage, and this last one was the impacts of climate change. So this multi-stakeholder spent the day together and came up with a series of strategies that they co-created across their disciplines to ensure the inclusion of blue foods in Mexico's national agendas and international climate commitments. Next slide. And exactly a year later, Mexico updated or released their updated NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, which is essentially the national plan for how a country will achieve their commitments under the Paris Agreement as a part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the how they plan to achieve what they said they were going to do. And they released their updated NDC just this past couple weeks at the COP. And there are 2 areas, one under mitigation, one under adaptation, where blue foods were incorporated. And it wasn't just incorporated, but we see exact inputs and lines of actions that were developed in the strategy meeting just a year ago. So we could see that thread of how research to stakeholder engagement to action on the ground is coming through these targeted interventions. Next slide, please.
I'll share a bit about how, in addition to nationally determined contributions and countries taking commitments on blue foods, how we saw blue foods show up at COP30 last month. And it kind of connects to what Jane was speaking about in terms of the action agenda. One of the 6 thematic axes of the action agenda was transforming agriculture and food systems, which is huge. 5 years ago, there was not much presence of food at COP and not as much presence of the ocean at COP. And this year, the ocean and food systems were very much present within the action agenda. With the leadership of the Brazil Ministry of Fisheries and Aquaculture that the coalition engaged with very closely over the past year, there was a suite of side events and other events at the COP focused on aquatic foods, to the point where at some points they were overlapping with each other, and you sort of had to choose between which of the aquatic food events that you were going to be going to. As part of the action agenda, the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition was selected as an initiative within the activation groups, and this led to the formation of 2 plans to accelerate solutions that highlight aquatic foods. So these plans to accelerate solutions under the action agenda are meant to be how different initiatives are going to be coming together in the future to think about implementation on these topics of relevance to climate. One of these plans to accelerate solutions is focused on algae aquaculture and is being led by the UN Global Seaweed Initiative. And the other is called Aquatic Food Systems as Climate Solutions and is being led by FAO Blue Transformation with the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition as a cooperating entity. And so what's exciting about these plans is that it sort of takes some of the commitments that are being made as part of the action agenda and thinks about the implementation and who the partners need to be to bring this work forward. And so seeing that the fact that the coalition and coalition members are part of those plans is a real strength to the next few years of engagement. Next slide, please. So these are just some links to resources related to the research and the coalition, and I'm sure they'll also be shared with after the webinar too. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you all. The presentations are great, and I'm sure there's so many questions bubbling up. So before we go to the audience, I want to start with a quick panel discussion for some questions that have been prickling in my brain. And Rashab, I want to start with you and kind of building on what Carly and Laura just shared of the connection of EDF's work to the action agenda space. Can you tell us a bit more of what DEMA's role looked like this year at COP and how we were engaging with the action agenda in particular?
Yeah, so the Dairy Methane Action Alliance was invited to be part of the action agenda. Like you mentioned, Jane, there were 30 work streams, and we were part of the sustainable agriculture work stream. In addition to just kind of providing resources and updates on what's happening with the initiative, we were also able to shape what's being called as the plan to accelerate solutions, where we are able to collectively, as a group that are working on similar issues, bring forward some of the key solution sets that we are seeing traction and have near-term implementation ability. And so from both of those perspectives, I think it was a great shift in how things are shaping at COP, because thus far we've seen a bit more of a top-down approach where the agenda is kind of set and the conversations are happening. But this time around there was some ability to do a bit more of the bottom-up approach, and I think the action agenda allowed us to be able to be part of that process.
Yeah, these plans to accelerate solutions are almost like transition plans for NGOs for the next 5 years. Like, how do we actually get the steps in place to move forward some of these topics collectively, which is quite exciting and a new way of working. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on for the next 5 years. Joint question for Carly and Laura. Could you explain a bit more about EDF and Stanford operating as the co-secretariats for the coalition? Like, how does this partnership work? What are the different roles and what does each organization bring to the initiative?
Yeah, I mean, I think within any sort of coalition, multi-stakeholder coalition, it's important to have sort of a core secretariat or leadership group that can kind of work on the day-to-day functions of a coalition. So that's exactly what the Secretariat does within the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. And I think something important about the structure is that the coalition is chaired by the government of Iceland. So you have this government voice within the Secretariat, and then EDF, a nonprofit, and Oceana, a nonprofit, and the Center for Ocean Solutions with academic perspectives. And so what is helpful about the Secretariat structure within the coalition is that you have a multi-stakeholder coalition and a multi-stakeholder Secretariat. And you can kind of bring together these different perspectives and needs. And at least from the perspective of an academic institution, I think what's helpful in that is understanding what types of research and what types of resources are needed. So yeah, the guidelines are an example of that, but more broadly, not just doing research for research sake, but thinking about what are the pressing needs, what are the pressing questions that countries are asking when they're considering blue foods in their climate planning and their food system planning, and how can academic institutions answer some of those questions or create resources that could be useful in those types of discussions. And then Carly will be able to speak more about sort of where that shows up within sort of NGO space.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. So I think because we have teams on the ground all over the world, we could hear about the needs from the perspective of communities, what they want to know, and how we could bring that and position their their concerns or their questions to decision makers. So I think we could create that important linkage from getting the data to what's happening on the ground, but also getting the voices out there from the people that we're working with on the day-to-day basis. I think at this COP, since it was so focused on solutions and implementation and action, hearing what's already happening to provide, this foundation that these aren't like new necessarily. We have solutions, we have strong examples, and it's also showing other people and other communities, other country, what's possible when you get, the right foundation and when you get the right policies in place and the right incentives. So I think making that connection from that research to people on the ground and building that network is really important. And that's a perspective that EDF and other civil societies bring. We're creating a platform to get that out there.
And on this implementation perspective, Rashab, I want to turn back to you and hear about some of the progress that we've seen within DEMA and some of the big success stories, some of the challenges, and how EDF is working with all of these different stakeholders to overcome them.
Yeah, great question, Jen. And maybe I'll start with the successes. And so, like I highlighted in my presentation, there's definitely been tangible success from the initiative. So 7 of the 10 companies, all but the new ones, have disclosed their dairy methane emissions, and 5 of the world's first dairy methane action plans, led by these companies, which are not just dairy sector first, but also much broader than that. Our hope is that it'll have a positive impact across the industry. So that's kind of the tangible impact. But I think we've also seen a bit more of an intangible impact where the profile of methane is raised. There is a greater acceptance and desire to act on methane. And that is a big win for us. We're seeing greater companies that are now stepping forward on methane action and publicly talking about it and creating plans. And even if they're not part of DEMA, they are kind of signaling that this is a critical issue and taking those initial steps. So that's on the successes. However, we're not claiming victory. There continues to be a lot more work that needs to happen. And one of the key challenges is finance. I think some of the solutions that we have seen there do exist certain solutions that have been wins that Abhinav was alluding to in his early remarks. But some of these solutions or also happen to be a cost that needs to be borne by somebody, and that for implementation that happens on the ground. And so right now, we're trying to find ways of how we can find the right groups to take on some of these burdens so that at the end of the day, the farmer is able to implement these solutions and do it in a way that is de-risked in some way. And so EDF has been working on trying to address this challenge as well. We have been working in the US to come up with what we're calling as the Dairy Impact Fund, which is a low cost revolving loan for farmers to deploy manure methane reducing solutions, which happen to be capital intensive solutions. And we're doing this in partnership with the Innovation Center for US Dairy, and trying to bring along supply chain actors who will be able to add their incentives, bring in philanthropic grants and impact investing capital that essentially that blend that makes it a low cost loan for the farmers. So those are some ways that we are trying to address the key common challenges that we have heard across the supply chain, including that of finance.
And we touched on this through the presentations a bit, but could you, and this question is open for everyone, but could you tell us a bit more of how these global convenings really translate into real change for the programs that we work on? Seeing new country commitments, does it bring in new partners? Is it elevating overlooked solutions? Like what tangible outcomes have you all seen from the COP processes? And with that, what would you really like to see from future COPs to accelerate your work? Maybe Carly and Laura, I'll go to you first.
Sure, I could hop in and then Laura could add anything I may have missed. I think it's doing all those things, right? When you have a big international convening, countries are always looking and partners are always looking to share the progress they're making or announcements. So I think that's the first thing. It provides a platform, especially when there are real wins that are happening throughout the year. It also is providing a platform for people to come together around common challenges. Finance, as was just mentioned, seems to be one that, is needed in all these sectors. And it's a place where you have those diverse participants and those diverse actors coming together. And I think there's a lot of conversations around co-creation of solutions. I also believe that it provides a space for people who are living this day to day. One of the key activities that the coalition has supported is bringing actors, fisher folk, bringing women who are processing, bringing, fishers on the water to share their stories with people that they're not in daily communication with. And I think that brings more of a face, an example, to people that aren't always have access to hearing what's happening. It brings reality to these larger conversations that sometimes stay at such a high level, but really impact people on the ground. And it's important that there's representation at the big events, so we could build and work with people who are facing these challenges on a day-to-day.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, and I think sort of a piece that I would add to that, and we've touched on this sort of previously, but that really shifting from sort of big high-level commitments, kind of more theoretical statements, to practicalities and sort of what's really happening on the ground, what's really needed to move forward, what work is already happening, who is already involved. And I think that shift is something that I hope to kind of see continue to build over the next few years. I think whether that's through these plans to accelerate solutions that are sort of, here are pathways that we can take to move some of these pieces forward, or whether that's through other structures. I mean, I think that's what I'd hope to see, because I think there's an urgency to these issues that necessitates implementation, of some of these commitments. And so I think that was a shift at this COP, and I think that would be something that would really strengthen the COP process, is to kind of have some of these solutions moving forward and some of these collaborations moving forward, whether that's with countries or sort of civil society actors that are participating at COPs as well.
And if I were to just quickly add on that, we've seen a lot of momentum. The momentum is definitely palpable, whether it is from countries, civil society, or citizens in general. And with this new frame of action agenda, there is that bottom-up approach that is now happening. However, as was very evident from the outcome from this COP, there is a bit of a divide between what's happening on the ground and what initiatives are happening, and how that reflects in the final outcome. So I personally would love to see that bridge over hopefully next COP, but in the coming few years, where this momentum and this action on the ground is truly reflected in outcomes at COP. And then the second bit that we'd like to maybe see a bit more of is, how does this then translate back to, we spoke about, I mentioned the 4 groups, so countries, companies, civil society, and citizens, but how does this then translate back to the farmers on the ground? And I think that is another bit, or fisher folk on the in the sea. So I think that is the other bit that I'd love to see more of, as to what's that translatory bit that then we can take back to some of our constituents and say, this is what changed, and this is how it will help you in doing more for the planet.
And I have one final question from me. It's a bit of a speed round question, so try to keep it to 1 sentence max. But we keep hearing implementation, like all year, that's the buzzword. And I think it means different things to different people. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What does implementation mean for you and your work?
Do what is feasible today, quickly, and more than what you were doing yesterday. So whether it's incremental or bringing scale, whether it's incremental or step change. I think that to me is implementation.
I think to me, there's sort of a co-design approach, like bringing together different partners, different perspectives that are relevant to making change and sort of bringing those folks together to take the next step, even if it's a small step, to just take the next step.
For me, it's breaking bottlenecks when it comes to financing. We have these big, huge funds, but it's really hard to get them to communities on the ground. So how can we help facilitate that access?
And that's a perfect segue to the Q&A because we are getting a couple of questions around the finance piece. So I'm going to read on behalf of those who submitted. And again, a reminder, anyone can submit questions through the Q&A chat box and then it comes through on our end. So the first one is from someone at DGV, India's first integrated dairy fintech, insurtech, and marketplace platform. They're exploring strategic partnerships to strengthen climate positive interventions for dairy farmers. And they're interested in checking if EDF engages in co-investing or co-financing initiatives in the dairy sector.
I could take this in a bit of if you'd like to. We we do engage, but not necessarily solution providers. We work with policymakers and companies to drive some of this co-investing. Also, sometimes EDF could be a misnomer with the fund, and so that gives the sense that we fund. But as a nonprofit, we support the enabling environment and helping create that to drive change. And so I don't know, Abhinav, if you'd like to add anything else to that.
Just a small bit. So we like, each country has its own legal environment. So we can only fund certain things, certain institutions. We are bounded by that. So that's one of the reason in terms of which guides our decision whom to or what to fund and what not to fund. That's one. But regardless of that, as Rishabh said, that we usually support ecosystems and how different ideas, different actors can come together and contribute. So we will definitely love to work with each and every one, but then it's more on an ecosystem level rather than individual ideas. But we do work with institutions and organizations who come up with breakaway interesting solutions for the climate action and for the farmers. Yeah.
And for the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition, are you accounting for the finance gap that's preventing or to prevent burdens from falling on fishermen, like with DEMA, with farmers?
So our engagement around financing right now has been at a higher level because for so long, these funds were not accessible for fisheries or aquaculture or in the aquatic food space. Even within climate finance, ocean-based climate solutions get 1 to 2% of funding a year, and that includes everything related to ocean. So that includes fishery management, MPAs. So we're really working hard to unlock and have, these funds recognize aquatic food systems, recognize the ocean as a climate solution to increase accessibility to the funds because they just don't exist right now.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to pivot a bit and ask a question around multilateral processes. We talked a lot about UNFCCC related processes, which we're throwing tons of acronyms around typical climate space. But that's the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. But there's many other UN frameworks that touch our work, like the UNCCD or the UNCBD. So wondering, do you work with any of these other multilateral processes? And maybe if you don't work directly with them or participate in any of the conferences that are surrounding them, like the other COPs that are happening, are there different pieces of like data, information, reporting that come through other UN systems that impact EDF's work?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one for the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition, because I think that's been one of the focus areas for the coalition is thinking about, I mean, aquatic food systems touch on so many pieces, right? It's food, it's, it's the ocean, it's climate, certainly, biodiversity, certainly as well. So I think one of the sort of strategies of the coalition has been trying to bring these conversations to different areas. So this year, for example, we engaged not only with the UNFCCC COP, but we sort of saw 2025 as an opportunity to engage in several key milestones related to aquatic foods. So in June, that was the UN Ocean Conference, where there was a very strong representation of aquatic foods there. And that's where a lot of the collaborations with the Brazil Ministry of Fisheries and Aquaculture started and launched to kind of build towards COP. And then another sort of key milestone this year was the UN Food Systems Summit +4 that happened in July in Ethiopia. And that the coalition launched as part of the first UN Food Systems Summit process. But I think what we've seen in some of those food conversations, UNFSS conversations, is that aquatic foods are very much underrepresented in those conversations still. There's very much a terrestrial focus of those conversations. So the coalition also engaged at that summit to bring sort of the aquatic with it to the food systems conversation. So I think that's been an approach of sort of not focusing on one process, but to think about the relevance of aquatic foods across many processes. And I think that's also brought new partners and new voices to the table, because I think it in UNFCCC conversations, it's been around climate and partners that are thinking about climate, but we were surprised at the openness of other food system focused organizations and coalitions to think about how they could be incorporating aquatic foods more strongly. And I think that these are partnerships that can kind of build on one another and strengthen one another.
And I'll just quickly add that the Dairy Methane Action Alliance was designed to be targeted on dairy methane and therefore has a very significant mitigation emphasis. However, there is, the dairy system's impacts and is impacted by some of the other bits like biodiversity, and there's an interest from some of our constituent companies and as well as EDF to incorporate some of that in the do. So, for instance, some solutions, especially on manure, methane, etc., could have a positive impact on biodiversity. And how do we kind of quantify that and bring that in as we help, especially if we're looking to finance some of these solutions? How could we bake that within those so that they help us finance some of the solutions? So that's definitely something that we are looking to explore. Of course, these conventions are big for EDF, and the bigger EDF is participating in this, and we keep a close tab on the report outs from that to track what's happening across those conversations.
And with 1 minute to go, I'll wrap up with one final question, which is thinking of COP31. So we finished one COP and we're already planning for the next, but what are your hopes in the food system space for COP31? And we'll keep answers short.
I can start. So this year, as you said, like food was mentioned once and food system was not mentioned at all in the final one. So a stronger push from the countries, a stronger recognition and a stronger action. So that's what I'll be expecting from the next one.
If I were to add, so +1 to what Abhinav said, but also seeing greater continuity in processes and how we can bring the action agenda and pass and keep moving forward with some of those so that there is opportunity for folks to self-organize and co-create that agenda as well.
I would say continuation and uptake of the action agenda and the plans for acceleration and creating an ecosystem that truly supports the delivery of these plans and bringing diverse stakeholders together in that delivery.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, and I would say I would hope to see more attention on the financing piece of these as well. So what resources are needed to advance these plans to accelerate solutions, and how can we unlock some of those resources to really make a difference. So I would hope to see a bit more focus on that too.
Great answers. I couldn't agree more. And I think the continuity piece is a big one. A lot of times it feels like COPs can be year by year, but it's exciting to have this opportunity with the new action agenda framework to be thinking of things a little bit more long-term and comprehensively. So yeah, again, a space to keep an eye on. If you're not engaged in the action agenda already, we're happy to discuss opportunities and what it looks like, and if there's other teams that could be involved. So please don't hesitate to connect with us further. We'll also be sharing a recording and the presentations from this session, so you can follow up with any specific questions. I know we didn't get to everything in the Q&A today. But lots of great discussion. Thank you to all of our amazing speakers. I'm always so proud to represent EDF in these spaces because we cover so many different areas of work. And I love that we focus on solutions. And that's what these seminars are all about. So thank you for sharing your experiences, solutions, and stories, and wishing everyone a really happy and healthy holiday season. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.